The ending is, it's not crystal clear, or is it?
The interesting thing about the ending to me is that some people think it is crystal clear. Most people think it's confusing and ambiguous, and a little bit frustrating. As far as I'm concerned, the way the ending is intended to work is that, for me, the film is all about his subjective view of the world and his inability to perceive any kind of objective truth beyond that. And for me, that's kind of interesting, because I think that's how we all go through everyday life. And I think if somebody cared to watch the film a second time, you know, they would find indications of what that objective truth is, as far as I'm concerned.
I'm a self-taught filmmaker. I never went to film school. I never studied filmmaking in any way. I started making films when I was a kid, when I was, I think, 7 years old, making films using my dad's Super 8 camera. And I just carried on making films as I grew up.
I mean, I've always been a student of films. And I think it was Stanley Kubrick who said the best way to learn how to make a film is to make a film. And that was sort of my approach. I started making films when I was 7 years old on Super 8, you know, and I never really stopped. And when you're doing films just with friends, with no money, you know, on a shoestring, you have to be able to do all the jobs, because it gives you confidence as a filmmaker. I couldn't get into film school, and I started just making my own films on 16mm. And I think, in retrospect, that was fortunate for me. I think I was better suited to just making films and learning from that than I would have been to learning in a more formal structure. My first feature, Following, you know, was made on 16mm with friends who just did it on the weekends and put it together.
Pretty cheap.
Very cheap. All told, about $6,000. So
Yeah, that...
it was very, very cheap.
We were just shooting on Saturdays. We all had jobs in the week. And so not everybody would turn up, and sometimes you'd be recording sound, and sometimes you'd be shooting the film, and it's a wonderful way to learn everything.
When we were making Following, I was working in the field of corporate videos. I was doing camera work and sound work for media training sessions for companies, that kind of thing. And I actually learned a lot doing that kind of video camera work. I learned a lot about going into an environment, and that was very much the production methodology we transferred over to the film we were making.
In the case of Following, the nonlinear structure was a somewhat unusual choice. But it's those things that are the strength of the project. It's the things that you can bring to what you're doing or bring to the filmmaking craft that maybe not everybody else is doing.
The condition that the protagonist suffers from, it is a real-life condition. And I researched it a little bit. It's different from conventional amnesia. He knows everything about himself. He knows all the objective information his long-term memory provides him with. You know, what his name is, where he was born, where he grew up, who he was married to, all this stuff. But at some point a few years before, he's lost the ability to make new memories. Ultimately, the film is really just an extrapolation of the way I live my life. You know, I write notes on my hands, I take pictures of things, I have objects around, you know, in my apartment to remind me of things, you know, this sort of thing. So the script really is just an exaggeration of this. And I felt that was very important to maintain, because to me what makes the film interesting is that it is an exaggeration, an extrapolation of all of our lives. It's not a freak show. You know, this is not a freakish character. This is actually an everyman. This is one of us. He's a vehicle for making us think about our place in the world and how we identify ourselves in a slightly different way.
Tell us a little bit what Following is about. And it's a movie you shot over the course of a year, I guess, whenever money would come together.
Yeah. Following is a story of a writer, somebody who wants to be a writer, who's living in London, very busy city, and he takes to following individual people, picking someone out of the crowd, seeing where they go, what they do, and becomes addicted to this, quite frankly.
The Following is my explanation. I'd been on my own for a while and getting kind of lonely, and that's when I started shadowing.
Shadowing?
I started to follow people.
Why'd you do it?
How can I explain? You ever been to a football match, just let your eyes go over, drift across a crowd of people, and they slowly stop and fix on one person, and all of a sudden that person isn't part of the crowd anymore. They become an individual, just like that.
I wrote Following at a time when I was living in the middle of London, much like the protagonist, and was amazed how crowded that city is. You walk on the streets and you're just surrounded by people. And I became interested in the idea of what happens if a character were to decide to break down the normal protocols that exist between people. What if he were to just choose somebody at random from the crowd and start investigating their life for no reason other than an arbitrary interest in people. The whole story was really constructed around extrapolations of the world around us. I like to think that we were able to do something that was not just about the influences on it, but kind of personal as well. And so, you know, the actors didn't have costumes. They had to figure out what they were going to wear themselves and bring it to set. Jerry Theobald, who plays the protagonist, we shot in his apartment where he was really living. We shot on the streets that we were walking around every day. And so the film has a strong personal connection to who we all were at the time when we made it.
Now,
Sure.
if you just put it like, okay, you got like you've got these, let's say the classic 3 acts, and then you have the color, and then a line for the black and white, and then the flashbacks and
All right,
the
let's
story.
have a go.
Okay.
It's confusing because I don't think pictorially, diagrammatically. So, okay, what do you have? You have the beginning of the film here. What's the best way to draw it? Best way to draw it is as a hairpin, like that. That's basically the end of the movie. This stuff is the black and white stuff. This is color. And this is running backwards as a series of jumps. And what we do is we cut between the two the whole way through. So we alternate scene here, scene there, scene there, scene there, scene there, scene there, and they meet towards the end of the film. Yeah, the black and white stuff is all derived from a forward-running sequence. So if you take these individual black and white scenes, they run forwards. If you stick them together, they actually overlap in the same way that the backwards scenes overlap. It's not quite so obvious when you're watching the movie, but you know, it begins with him sort of shaving his thigh and answering the phone and everything, and in fact, these actions overlap. So there is a suggestion that in fact, and it is the case, that you can stick all these scenes together and achieve one sort of long scene effectively. And that episodic structure was one that I wanted to employ because the overlapping flashbacks of the color sequences, it's a very complex structure. The black and white stuff is actually pretty simple to follow because it follows the basic episodic structure we're all very familiar with. I mean, from watching TV, you know, it's like you break something up with TV commercials, you know, what have you. But it's very easy to just keep following a very simple forward progression. In this case, it's him on his own in a room speaking on a telephone, so it's a very simple sequence of forward progression, and it's not too difficult as we return to it to just tap back into it and say, okay, this is where we are. We're back here on familiar ground. We're just going to get a bit more information about, you know, who he is and you know what he's discussing on this telephone call.
Do you think the story could have been told simply chronologically?
The story couldn't be told chronologically for a very simple reason, which is that if you reorder the elements of the story chronologically, logically it holds together, but it tells a completely different story. It's pretty much unwatchable. It's just this guy being abused by people around him and all the rest. For me, the interest of the material was to get inside his head and to see himself in the heroic terms that he sees himself, the way he casts himself as the avenging hero. And the only way to do that, as far as I could see, was to deny the audience the same knowledge that he's denied. In that way, make them see things through his point of view. And the way I came up with to do that was to order the story backwards. I wrote the story exactly as I wanted to see it on screen. I wrote it backwards. I've never viewed the elements sort of turned around the other way. And to me, the structure and the content are inseparable. And if you reordered the material, you'd have a completely different story.
But when I look back at Following, I think it was an ideal starting point for me, because the way that film was shot,
It's entirely handheld camera. You know, I just had the camera on my shoulder, and so I would follow the actors around. I would get them to rehearse the scene. We rehearsed for months and months and months before we shot anything, because we didn't have money for more than a couple of takes, 1 or 2 takes. And so we would stage the scenes in a very spontaneous way where the actors knew the dialogue, they knew the scene incredibly well. We would go to the location and they would walk it through, and then I would just follow them with the camera. And I think that was the right approach for me and set me on the path of always thinking about and considering the point of view of the storytelling.
I think what following represents is kind of the peak of what I was able to do on my own or just with friends, just using our own resources and borrowing equipment and sort of using the things around us to make a film.
I've been interested in non-chronological narrative structures for quite a long time. And once you start thinking about the idea of point of view, I think time shifting, the idea of nonlinear structures or non-chronological structures becomes a real freedom. And for me, it kind of found its ultimate expression in Memento, because that was as strong an alignment as I could find between a narrative structure and a point of view. Memento first came around when I was almost finished with Following, my first film. I'd done a fairly comprehensive cut on it, and then I'd moved from London out to Los Angeles, and I went by way of Chicago and met up with my younger brother. And my dad had a car from when they lived in Chicago that he was giving me, so we drove it out to Los Angeles. And on the course of that drive, my brother Jonah, he told me a story he was working on as a short story. It was this story about this guy with this particular condition where he couldn't make new memories. You know, he was exploring different ways of doing it and thinking about it. And the first thing I said to him was, if you could find a way of writing that short story from the first person, sort of subjectively, that would be an incredible thing. If you could put somebody in the head of somebody who couldn't make new memories, who was suffering from this kind of trouble, that would be amazing.
And I asked him if I could take the idea while he was writing his short story, whether I could take it and write a screenplay from it. And thank goodness he agreed to that and let me do that.
And my solution to telling the story subjectively was to deny the audience the same information that the protagonist is denied. And my approach to doing that was to effectively tell the story backwards. That way, when we meet a character, we don't know, just like the protagonist, how he's met that person, whether he's even met that person before, or whether or not they should be trusted, that kind of thing. So the story is basically told backwards. It's basically told as a series of flashbacks that go further and further back in time.
Now, where was I?